During the national salute to hospitalized veterans, Chuck Norris displays in a very visible manner the bond of brotherhood.
3 years ago, I got invited over there to go to a kickboxing event in Moscow. And I thought, well, I've never been there, so I'd like to go over there. And because, I had black belts that have come over and trained with me from Russia, but I'd never been there.
At 85 years old, Chuck Norris remains one of the most iconic faces in American pop culture. A name that evokes unstoppable strength, unwavering courage, and a kind of masculine mythos that has echoed through cinema and television for generations. From his legendary battle with Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon to his 8-season reign as the indestructible Cordell Walker in Walker, Texas Ranger, Norris became more than a man, he became a symbol. Children grew up believing he could stop a bullet with a glare. Adults admired the calm resolve behind every punch, and internet jokes turned him into an untouchable superhuman. But the truth, buried beneath layers of fame and fanfare, tells a very different story, one of pain, private grief, and a life haunted by scars invisible to the public eye. This is not just the story of an action hero. It's the heartbreaking chronicle of a man who has suffered in silence, whose fame masked a fragile soul shaped by childhood trauma, war, devastating loss, and personal regret. At a glance, Norris's legacy is golden. 6 consecutive years as karate's middleweight champion, countless blockbuster films, and a global TV persona that defined a generation. But behind that stoic facade lies a man who has endured unspeakable heartbreak, from growing up in a house ruled by fear, to losing his beloved younger brother to war, to navigating a devastating divorce and discovering a hidden daughter decades too late. At an age when most seek peace, Norris continues to carry the burden of a lifetime of emotional injuries. What began as a legend of fists and fury now unravels into something far more human, a tragic tale of strength born not from invincibility, but from relentless survival. And as the curtain falls on his twilight years, the world begins to realize that Chuck Norris wasn't just the man who could defeat anyone. He was the man who had to survive everything. Long before the world saw him as an indestructible warrior, Chuck Norris was just Carlos Ray Norris, a shy, frightened boy growing up in the suffocating silence of a broken home. Born in 1940 in Ryan, Oklahoma, his early life was anything but heroic. Instead of laughter and security, his childhood was filled with fear, hunger, and emotional isolation. His father, Ray Norris, returned from World War II a changed man, haunted by trauma and numbed by alcohol. What began as a war hero's homecoming quickly deteriorated into a nightmare of instability, rage, and emotional neglect. Chuck, along with his 2 brothers, lived under the constant threat of violence as Ray's alcoholism turned the household into a war zone. Even small noises, running water or a creaking floorboard, could trigger terrifying outbursts. His mother, Wilma, tried desperately to hold the family together, hiding $5 bills just to feed her sons, only for Ray to come home and steal even that from them. The fear was so intense that one night during a drunken episode, Ray forced the entire family into a car and began driving recklessly toward Arizona, swerving on the road as Wilma sobbed and begged him to stop. These traumatic episodes left deep emotional scars on Chuck, who often sought refuge in the matinees of cowboy films where he dreamed of being strong, just like the heroes on screen. But those fleeting moments of imagination were crushed the moment he stepped back into his grim reality. At school, he was quiet, awkward, and invisible. His peers didn't see a fighter, they saw a ghost of a kid who barely spoke and never smiled. At home, things only worsened when his father caused a fatal accident and was sentenced to a work camp. Any hopes of a turnaround were shattered when Ray returned angrier, drunker, and more violent than ever. Chuck's breaking point came at age 14, when during a violent outburst, he grabbed a hammer and stood between his father and mother, a trembling boy driven to protect the only source of love he had left. That moment didn't end the pain, but it marked a silent vow that would define his life. He would never become the man who made him afraid. And from that vow, the seed of the Chuck Norris legend was born, not from strength, but from trauma. When Chuck Norris enlisted in the United States Air Force at just 18 years old, it wasn't out of ambition but desperation. A need to escape the chaos of a childhood ruled by fear and to find structure in a world that had offered him nothing but uncertainty. Stationed at Asan Air Base in South Korea in 1958, he was introduced to martial arts not as a sport but as a lifeline. The shy, withdrawn teenager who had once been paralyzed by insecurity discovered in Taekwondo and Judo a language of discipline and purpose. His first attempts were awkward, his movements clumsy, but beneath that timid exterior was a spark waiting to ignite. Norris trained obsessively, falling on the mat countless times, but always rising with the stubborn determination never to feel powerless again. It wasn't about competition, it was about reclaiming control over a life that had long been out of his hands. In martial arts, he found an identity he never had growing up, a sense of self forged through pain, sweat, and perseverance. "I wasn't a standout in school, not much of an athlete," Norris would later confess, "but martial arts gave me an identity. That identity wasn't handed to him, it was carved out of every failed attempt, every bruised rib, every moment of doubt. When he returned home to California in 1962, he carried with him more than just a black belt. He carried a burning desire to build something from the fragments of his broken past. He opened his first karate school, often teaching to near-empty rooms and scraping by just to keep the lights on. But what others saw as a small storefront, Norris saw as sacred ground, a place where strength was built, not inherited. His students didn't just learn how to punch or kick, they learned how to fight through adversity just as he had. For Chuck Norris, martial arts was never about glory or trophies. It was a form of healing, a way to transform trauma into power. And in every stance, every kata, every drop of sweat, he wasn't just training his body. He was rewriting the story of a boy once broken by fear into a man who refused to be defined by it. After returning from South Korea with a newfound identity rooted in martial arts, Chuck Norris stepped into a world that didn't immediately open its arms to him. Unlike the cinematic heroes he would one day portray, there were no instant victories or overnight fame waiting on the other side of his training. Instead, Norris faced the cold, relentless grind of obscurity. His first karate school, humble, underfunded, and nearly always empty, served more as a symbol of his stubborn will than a profitable venture. He cleaned the mats himself, stared at vacant doorways hoping for students to arrive, and sometimes taught for hours only to earn pennies. Yet he never considered giving up. His belief in martial arts as a tool for personal transformation was too deeply embedded, and he was willing to sacrifice everything to make it work. By the early 1960s, Norris began entering karate tournaments not for glory but to prove to himself that he was worthy of the strength he had built. The results were brutal. Loss after loss chipped away at his confidence. Defeats were not just athletic, they were deeply emotional, triggering old feelings of inadequacy and helplessness that dated back to his childhood. But instead of retreating, he did what few could. He trained harder. Every night he returned to the dojo, drilling kicks, refining stances, perfecting strikes. His transformation wasn't from talent, it was from pain turned into precision. By 1967, after years of disappointment and self-doubt, Norris finally claimed his first major championship at the age of 27. That victory didn't just signal a career milestone, it was a personal rebirth. Over the next 6 years, he would dominate the karate circuit, holding the title of professional middleweight champion and turning his once-empty dojo into a respected institution. But even then, Norris knew that titles alone didn't define greatness. What mattered was how he used that platform to teach others the values that saved him: discipline, perseverance, and inner strength. His rise wasn't meteoric. It was forged slowly, painfully, through endless failure and refusal to surrender. In a world quick to celebrate flashy talent, Chuck Norris became something far rarer. A man whose strength came from choosing not to quit again and again until the world had no choice but to recognize him. Chuck Norris's transition from karate champion to movie star may seem inevitable in hindsight, but in reality, it was a journey marked by anxiety, rejection, and the constant fear of being typecast as nothing more than a second-rate fighter. His major cinematic breakthrough came in 1972 when he appeared opposite Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon, a film that would become legendary not just for its action, but for the symbolic clash between East and West. The scene in Rome's Colosseum where Norris battled Lee became one of the most iconic fight sequences in film history. But for Norris, it also ignited an inner war. While audiences marveled at the choreography, Norris feared he'd be remembered solely as the man who lost to Bruce Lee. That performance, which could have buried his aspirations, instead opened a back door into Hollywood. But the years that followed were anything but easy. Unlike Stallone or Schwarzenegger, Norris didn't have the benefit of charisma-drenched scripts or instant box office pull. His early films stumbled, often dismissed by critics and overshadowed by flashier contemporaries. He fought not with his fists but with resilience to carve out a space where he could exist not as a gimmick, but as a legitimate actor with depth and discipline. His turning point came in 1978 with Good Guys Wear Black, a film that finally resonated with American audiences. At 38 years old, Chuck Norris became the clean-cut, no-nonsense hero the nation craved in an era of political turmoil and cinematic excess. What followed was a cascade of roles: The Octagon, Lone Wolf McQuad, Missing in Action, Code of Silence, The Delta Force, each film layering his reputation as a cinematic symbol of justice and patriotism. But for Chuck, every role carried emotional weight far beyond the script. Each time he portrayed a soldier or avenger, he wasn't just acting, he was channeling real pain, honoring his fallen brother, confronting his past, and trying to silence the echo of wounds that never fully healed. The fight scenes, the stoic glances, the righteous victories on screen were reflections of deeper battles fought in silence. Norris didn't become a movie star because he was the loudest or the flashiest. He became one because every line he delivered, every punch he threw, carried the gravity of a man who had survived everything the world had thrown at him. Behind every role Chuck Norris ever played, every salute, every uniform, every staged battlefield, lurked a ghost that never stopped haunting him. the memory of his younger brother Wieland, who was killed in action during the Vietnam War at just 21 years old. It was 1970 when the devastating telegram arrived, delivering a blow that no amount of martial arts training could block. Wieland had been walking point on a patrol, the most dangerous position in the line, when he spotted an enemy ambush and shouted a warning to his unit. That warning saved lives, but it also cost him his own. The loss carved a canyon of grief in Chuck's soul that no film, fame, or fortune could ever fill. Wieland wasn't just a brother, he had been the light in their darkest days, the one who made jokes during the bleakest family moments, the one who somehow still believed in joy. Years before his death, Wieland had whispered a chilling premonition that he wouldn't live past 27. It seemed like a passing moment of sadness at the time, but it became a cruel prophecy fulfilled. For Chuck, who had grown up shielding his family from a violent father and who had once stood between rage and his mother with nothing but a hammer and trembling hands, losing Wieland was a wound deeper than any trauma that had come before. And the irony that Chuck would go on to portray soldiers, commandos, and war heroes on screen only twisted the blade further. Each time he held a rifle for a role, charged into gunfire, or delivered vengeance on camera, it wasn't just fiction. It was a painful reenactment of what he couldn't do in real life: save his brother. Even at the height of his success in the 1980s, with films grossing millions and fans cheering his every move, Chuck confessed that the pain of Wieland's death never left him. It followed him into makeup trailers, echoed in quiet moments between takes, and lived behind every steely stare captured on screen. In his heart, every triumph was stained with sorrow, every applause muffled by the silence left behind by the one person he couldn't protect. Wieland's sacrifice became more than a family tragedy. It became the invisible burden that Chuck carried through every frame of his career, a ghost that would never be exorcised. As Chuck Norris ascended to superstardom in the 1980s, the world saw only the triumphs: the box office hits, the awards, the admiration of millions. But off-screen, his personal life was slowly unraveling under the unbearable weight of success. In 1958, at just 18 years old, Norris had married his high school sweetheart, Diane Holchek. For 3 decades, their marriage had been the anchor that grounded him through poverty, disappointment, and eventual fame. They raised 2 sons together, Mike and Eric, who watched their father transform from a struggling karate instructor into a global icon. But fame, as Norris would later admit, is not gentle. The endless filming schedules, months of separation, the demands of maintaining a spotless public image, all slowly eroded the foundation of his marriage. By 1988, after 30 years together, the relationship collapsed in a quiet implosion that left Norris devastated. He described the divorce not as a moment of anger, but as a profound, disorienting shock, a rupture that left him adrift at the very peak of his career. And just as he was grappling with the end of his family life, another emotional earthquake struck. A letter arrived from a woman named Dina, claiming to be his daughter. Born in 1962 during Chuck's military service, Dina had lived her entire life unaware of her father's identity. Her mother had kept the truth hidden, fearing it would disrupt his marriage. But now, decades later, the truth could no longer stay buried. Norris, already emotionally raw from his divorce, was stunned. When he saw her face, he immediately recognized himself. But that recognition came with a tidal wave of guilt. He hadn't just missed her childhood, he had missed her entire life. He later said that while Dina became a blessing in his later years, he could never escape the burden of regret for the lost decades. His deep Christian faith, which emphasized accountability and integrity, made the revelation all the more painful. He reached out to Dina with humility, seeking forgiveness, but no apology could rewrite the years of absence. This wasn't the kind of pain that came with physical injury. It was the kind that settled into the soul, a permanent ache that reminded him that even the strongest men fail. And in that failure, Norris faced a new kind of reckoning, not as a warrior, but as a father who had to rebuild what was broken by time, silence, and secrets. By the time Chuck Norris stepped into the role of Cordell Walker in Walker, Texas Ranger in 1993, he was already a martial arts legend and action film star. But this television role catapulted him into a new stratosphere of fame, one that reached beyond moviegoers into the living rooms of families across the world. For 8 consecutive seasons until 2001, Norris became the embodiment of justice, a Texas lawman who could take down crime with a single kick and uphold morality without ever compromising his values. The show was a massive success, syndicated in over 100 countries, and it transformed Chuck Norris from a niche action figure into a global household name. Children idolized him, adults respected him, and even pop culture jokes only added to his larger-than-life reputation. But as the world embraced the indestructible image of Cordell Walker, Chuck Norris himself was enduring battles that no audience could see. Filming was grueling. The stunts, though choreographed, left his body battered and his spirit drained. Injuries piled up, and the constant pressure to maintain his heroic persona both on and off screen took a heavy emotional toll. Away from set, he found himself increasingly isolated, distanced from the very family life he had once cherished. The emotional cost of keeping up appearances, always strong, always righteous, began to bleed into his private moments. And no matter how many episodes aired or how many fan letters poured in, Norris could never escape the lingering shadows of his past. Every time he donned the Rangers uniform, it reminded him of the military uniforms his brother once wore, and every fight scene felt like a faint echo of a real war he could never win. Walker may have been a symbol of invincibility, but Chuck knew all too well what vulnerability felt like. Even as he delivered justice on screen, the pain of Whelan's death, the sting of divorce, and the guilt over his estranged daughter remained constant companions. Fame magnified his image, but it could not muffle the quiet sadness that lived behind his eyes. And so, while the world saw a man who seemed untouchable, Chuck Norris walked a solitary line between legend and loss, his real battles always unfolding when the cameras stopped rolling. Now at 85, Chuck Norris finds himself in a twilight chapter that is both peaceful and painfully introspective, a moment in life where the lights of fame have dimmed but the echoes of past battles remain loud. The world still sees him as the myth, the indestructible force who could roundhouse kick through any crisis. But inside, he carries a heart stitched together by loss, regret, and a fragile desire for redemption. Decades of stardom brought him wealth, admiration, and legacy, but none of those victories have erased the wounds that shaped him. The haunting memories of his brother Whelan's sacrifice continue to pierce his thoughts, especially in quiet moments when no one is watching. The face of a daughter he missed for 26 years remains a bittersweet reminder of what time can steal. And the breakdown of a marriage he thought would last forever still lingers in his soul like an old scar that never fully healed. Chuck has often spoken publicly about his Christian faith, using it not just as a moral compass but as a source of survival. In recent years, he has dedicated himself more deeply to philanthropy and family, perhaps in an effort to restore what was lost in the years of chaos, filming, and emotional distance. His later life has been marked by quieter work, less about cinematic glory and more about presence, being a better father, a more attentive husband, a man of integrity even when the spotlight is gone. Yet the tragedy of Chuck Norris lies not in failure but in the permanence of some regrets. Time cannot be reversed. His mother has passed on, his brother is long gone, and many of those who stood beside him in the early years have faded from his life. In his solitude, Norris has become a symbol not just of strength, but of survival. A man who endured beatings in childhood, heartbreak in adulthood, and the unbearable silence of grief. His story reminds us that even the strongest men break, and that what makes them legendary is not that they never fell, but that they stood back up, over and over, carrying the weight of every sorrow. Chuck Norris may never escape the tragedies that shaped him, but in facing them with dignity and courage, he has become something far greater than the sum of his victories. He has become a living testament to resilience. In the end, the story of Chuck Norris is not truly about invincibility, it is about endurance. The world saw the legend, a man who could silence a room with a stare, who conquered the big screen, who dominated television, and who for decades stood as the face of unwavering justice. But what the world didn't see, what was hidden beneath the headlines, the martial arts accolades, and the cinematic glory, was a man who spent his entire life outrunning pain. From a childhood soaked in fear to a brother stolen by war, from a marriage unraveled by fame to the discovery of a daughter decades too late, Chuck Norris carried emotional injuries that no stunt double could absorb. Each punch he threw on screen masked the blows life had delivered behind the scenes. His strength was never found in the fights he won, but in the sorrows he survived. It's easy to mistake fame for fulfillment, or to think that success means someone has conquered their demons, but Chuck's story is a sobering reminder that scars don't disappear with applause. They deepen in silence, in hotel rooms between filming, in family photos with one face missing, in letters read years too late. What audiences adored as stoicism was often grief without expression. What they cheered as power was sometimes just pain in armor. And now in his final years, Chuck Norris continues to live not as a myth but as a man, reflective, wounded, wiser, and still carrying the memories of those he couldn't save. He has transformed his losses into lessons, his guilt into purpose, and his regrets into quiet acts of redemption. For all the jokes, the memes, and the exaggerated feats, the real Chuck Norris never needed to be bulletproof. He only needed to keep going. And he did. His legacy will not just be measured by the roles he played or the belts he earned, but by the invisible battles he fought with dignity. In the end, even legends bleed, even heroes grieve. And the most extraordinary thing about Chuck Norris isn't that he was ever untouchable, but that he kept standing long after the world expected him to fall.